September 14, 1943. Dawn creeps over the small, fog-draped town of Saint Laurent in northern France. The streets lie empty, save for the distant echo of marching boots and the faint whine of a German reconnaissance plane slicing through the sky. In a single ordinary attic, a 14-year-old girl holds a map trembling in her hands, aware that the next message she delivers could save hundreds of lives or seal her own fate. The world around her had changed overnight. Saint Laurent, once a quiet town of cobblestone streets and market squares, was now a silent stage under Nazi occupation. Houses bore the marks of hurried departures, doors ajar, shutters closed, children's toys left abandoned in dusty corners. Fear was woven into every glance exchanged between neighbors. Yet amid the pervasive terror, life insisted on finding small spaces to breathe, a mother whispering a prayer, a shopkeeper glancing nervously at the horizon, children pretending to play as shadows of soldiers loomed in the distance. WWII had reached the heart of northern France in full force. By 1943, German forces were entrenched in towns and villages, controlling supply lines and communication. Every street, every alley was monitored. The resistance existed in whispers, in coded notes hidden in bread loaves, in the daring movements of ordinary citizens who refused to bow entirely to fear. And yet, for most adults, survival demanded caution. Mistakes could cost lives immediately. It was here in this town that a 14-year-old girl named Elodie Moreau, ordinary by all outward appearances, was preparing to do something extraordinary. Elodie had grown up with the sound of her father's stories about courage, about choices that mattered, but she had never imagined she herself would be the one to test that courage. Her eyes, large and dark, reflected the fear of what she was about to undertake, yet also a determination that seemed far beyond her years. Her mission had begun months earlier, almost by accident. A local resistance cell had discovered that German troops were planning a sudden sweep of Saint Laurent, intending to confiscate supplies, imprison suspected dissidents, and solidify control over the town. Critical intelligence had to be sent to the nearby Free French Command before dawn, a task that no adult dared risk. Elodie, small and unassuming, became the only viable courier. To the Germans, she was just another child. To her town, she was now its fragile, beating heart of hope. The tension in those early hours was unbearable. Every creak of a floorboard, every flutter of a curtain could betray her presence. Elodie's movements were precise, rehearsed in her mind dozens of times. She clutched the folded map tightly, hiding the inked route that detailed troop positions, supply caches, and the timing of the impending German sweep. Her heartbeat pounded in rhythm with the distant engine of a truck, a patrol making its rounds. She paused by the window, listening. A group of soldiers marched past the square below, their boots striking cobblestone with mechanical certainty. Their shadows stretched long in the morning light, reaching toward her attic as if to claim it. Elodie swallowed hard, adjusting her small scarf around her face, and prepared to descend the staircase that could carry her toward either salvation or capture. In that quiet, harrowing moment, she became the embodiment of courage in its purest form, not the courage of strength, but the courage of choice. She had no weapons, no allies within sight, only the weight of her responsibility pressing against her chest. And as she stepped into the corridor below, the first threads of history began to weave themselves around her small, determined figure, threads that would later reveal how one child could alter the course of an entire town's fate. Every second mattered, every decision carried consequences, and for Saint Laurent, an ordinary morning was about to become extraordinary. Elodie's journey down the narrow attic staircase was a study in controlled fear. Each creaking step demanded perfect timing, a measured pause, a listening ear trained to detect the faintest hint of danger. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching longer with every heartbeat. Outside, the town remained eerily silent, but the threat was omnipresent. Patrolling soldiers, watchful neighbors coerced into collaboration, and the unpredictable dangers of a war that had seeped into every street and household. As she emerged onto the cobblestone streets, Elodie became almost invisible. Small, swift, and silent, she navigated alleyways, ducked behind overturned carts, and used the fog as a cloak. Her route had been meticulously planned. The less obvious paths, the quietest corners, the sequences of safe houses where she could pause and gather her breath. Each choice was a calculated risk. Every turn she took was a step deeper into danger. Elodie had learned to read the rhythm of the town, the distant bark of a dog, the hum of a motor, even the shifting patterns of wind through the trees, to anticipate where danger might lie. At 14, her mind was sharp, alert, and unclouded by fear-induced hesitation that often gripped adults. She understood that hesitation could be fatal, both for herself and for the information she carried. Her destination was a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of St. Laurent, where a sympathetic farmer provided safe passage to the Free French Command. But getting there was far from simple. A German checkpoint had recently been set up on the main road, and patrols had increased along the usual routes. Elodie had memorized an alternate path through a disused mill, across a narrow bridge, and through dense woodland that few soldiers dared traverse. The terrain was rough, uneven, and perilous, yet it offered the only chance of avoiding detection. The first hurdle came at the mill. The wooden structure groaned under her weight, the boards threatening to betray her presence with every step. Dust rose in thin clouds, glimmering in the sparse morning light, and her own breathing seemed deafening in the silence. Elodie froze when she heard a distant shout, soldiers interrogating a villager on the other side of the river. She waited, heart hammering, willing herself to merge with the shadows until the danger passed. Minutes stretched into an eternity, but finally, the voices faded, leaving only the sound of her own pulse. Crossing the narrow bridge was equally tense. The river below was swollen from recent rains, water churning angrily, reflecting the grey sky above. A single misstep could mean not just capture, but death. Elodie placed one careful foot in front of the other, arms outstretched for balance, eyes fixed on the far side. The bridge swayed slightly under her weight, but she remained composed, a quiet determination radiating from every movement. By the time she reached the woodland, her lungs burned and her legs ached, yet her resolve never wavered. The trees offered shelter and concealment, but also hidden dangers, snags, roots, and the ever-present risk of a German patrol moving through the same area. She slowed her pace, ears attuned to every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig. The forest was alive with tension, a living entity that seemed to watch her passage, testing her nerve, her resolve, her courage. Hours earlier, back in the town square, Elodie's absence had already begun to ripple outward. Neighbors whispered of the girl who had taken on a task no adult dared attempt. In homes and workshops, the fear of discovery mingled with hope. If Elodie succeeded, the town could be spared from a devastating sweep. If she failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. The weight of responsibility pressed down, invisible yet suffocating, on every corner of St. Laurent. Elodie's journey was more than a physical trek. It was a test of character, of ingenuity, of bravery that defied her age. She carried not just a map, but the fate of her entire town. And while each step forward was silent, each heartbeat carried the thunderous impact of history being written in real time, under the cloak of fog, shadow, and uncertainty. As the first rays of late morning filtered through the forest canopy, Elodie paused to rest. Her hands were blistered, her legs weary, yet she could not linger long. The German patrols would not wait. The clock of fate was ticking relentlessly, and the next decision she made could determine the survival of hundreds. Elodie emerged from the shadowed woodland and approached the edge of the farmer's property. The farmhouse was modest, its stone walls weathered by time and storm, surrounded by fields that stretched into the horizon. From a distance, it appeared peaceful, an oasis of calm amid the encroaching chaos, but Elodie knew better. Every building could hide danger. Every friendly face might conceal suspicion under fear. She crouched behind a haystack at the edge of the field, scanning the yard. Two men were working near a cart, their movements deliberate but cautious. Elodie recognized them immediately as members of the local resistance, a small group that had risked their lives countless times to protect the town and relay vital information to Free French forces. They had agreed to meet her here, but she had no way of knowing if it was safe this morning. A sudden clatter of tools startled her. Elodie froze, heart hammering, and waited. The men glanced toward the sound, exchanging brief nods, then returned to their work. Relief washed over her in a quiet, trembling wave. She crept forward, every muscle tense, every sense sharpened. The farmhouse door opened before she reached it. An older woman appeared, eyes sharp yet welcoming. "Elodie," she whispered, voice low but urgent, "come inside, quickly." Inside, the farmhouse was dimly lit. the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and bread baking from the previous night. Resistance members huddled around a wooden table, maps and papers spread before them. Elodie laid the folded map on the table, her small hands shaking despite her efforts to remain composed. The men and women leaned in, tracing the routes she had memorized and marking troop positions, supply depots, and patrol schedules. "This is it," said one of the men, voice taut with tension. "If this information reaches the Free French Command before noon, we can prevent the sweep. If not, we all risk everything." Elodie's throat tightened. The weight of her actions pressed on her again, heavier than before. She had crossed rivers, forests, and bridges, evaded patrols, and navigated the streets of St. Laurent under constant threat. And now, in the quiet, dimly lit farmhouse, she waited for the final confirmation that her mission was succeeding. Outside, the German forces were beginning their morning patrols. Trucks rumbled along distant roads, boots struck the cobblestones, and the occasional bark of a dog punctuated the tense air. Any mistake, any slip, could turn Elodie's courageous journey into a tragedy for the entire town. The resistance members worked quickly. One typed a coded message to the Free French Command, another double-checked the coordinates and troop schedules. All the while, Elodie watched, her hands folded, her young face pale but resolute. The air was thick with anticipation, each second a silent drumbeat echoing the town's fate. Finally, a messenger arrived to carry the message beyond enemy lines. Elodie exhaled slowly, allowing herself a fraction of relief, but she knew her role was not yet complete. The return journey loomed, fraught with the same perils she had already faced, and the German forces were now more alert, more vigilant than before. As she prepared to leave the farmhouse, Elodie paused at the door, glancing back at the resistance members who had risked so much to aid her. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine what life could be like if she succeeded. Streets free of soldiers, boots, children playing without fear, families safe from sudden raids. That vision propelled her forward, giving her courage when exhaustion threatened to claim her. The journey back was no less dangerous than the trip to the farmhouse. The patrols had intensified, their movements more unpredictable. Elodie moved silently, using every skill she had learned, every lesson of stealth and observation she had absorbed in the weeks leading up to this mission. She crawled beneath fences, slipped through narrow gaps between buildings, and paused for long stretches of time in the shadows, listening for the telltale signs of discovery. Hours passed, and the town remained tense and silent, unaware of the quiet hero making her way through their streets. Elodie knew that every step she took was a gamble, but there was no turning back. The town's survival depended on her resolve, her courage, and her ability to remain invisible in the face of danger. As she reached the outskirts of St. Laurent once more, the first signs of dusk appeared on the horizon. Shadows lengthened, and the town seemed to hold its breath. Elodie pressed on, determined to complete her mission and ensure that the risk, fear, and courage of the past day were not in vain. Night was falling over St. Laurent, draping the town in a shroud of darkness that could either protect or betray her. Elodie moved like a shadow, the memory of every creaking floorboard, every barking dog, every soldier's shout, guiding her along familiar streets. The map she had delivered earlier now burned in her mind. She knew each alley, each hideaway, each risk-laden shortcut as if it were an extension of herself. Yet the danger had evolved. German patrols had grown more unpredictable, their boots hammering the cobblestones in irregular patterns, their searchlights slicing through the fog. One wrong turn, one misstep, and Elodie could be captured. Captured, and the lives she had fought so hard to protect could be condemned. Her young mind raced, calculating every option, every evasive tactic. She reached the old town bridge, the same structure she had crossed earlier in daylight. Now, under the cover of darkness, it was both easier and more treacherous. Shadows distorted its shape, concealing gaps and weaknesses in the wooden planks. Below, the river churned like a dark vein, threatening to swallow any mistake. She inched forward, hand gripping the weathered rope railing, muscles taut, senses alert to every sound. Midway across, a distant bark startled her. A guard's lantern swung into view, illuminating the riverbank below. Elodie froze, heart hammering. She pressed herself against the side of the bridge, breathing shallowly, willing herself to disappear into the darkness. The lantern's beam wavered and then moved on, leaving her trembling but unseen. Crossing the bridge felt like a lifetime. Each step was a negotiation with fate, a test of courage, and a testament to the discipline of a child thrust into a role no one should endure. When she finally reached the far side, she allowed herself a brief exhale, though she knew there was no time to rest. The final stretch, through the outskirts of St. Laurent and back to her own home, still lay ahead. The town itself seemed eerily still, as if holding its breath. Windows were shuttered, streets empty, and the faint smell of smoke and damp earth filled the air. Elodie slipped along walls, ducked behind carts, and navigated narrow passages, each shadow a potential threat. Her body ached, her legs threatened to give way, yet she moved with the precision of someone far older than her years. Suddenly, a patrol emerged from an alley ahead. Elodie froze, pressed herself against the wall, and watched as the soldiers moved methodically, boots striking stone in rhythm. One of them paused, glanced toward her hiding place. Time seemed to stretch, seconds expanding into what felt like hours. Elodie's chest rose and fell in controlled, shallow breaths. The soldier turned, continued his patrol, and vanished into the darkness. Relief and terror surged together, a mix that only intensified her resolve. By the time she reached her street, Elodie's movements were almost automatic. She knew that one final obstacle remained. The neighborhood had grown more dangerous in her absence, neighbors nervous and alert, and the threat of informants ever present. She moved silently past familiar doors, through shadows of abandoned bicycles and scattered toys, her mind scanning for signs of danger, even in the mundane. Finally, she reached her own home. The front door was unguarded, the windows dark. Inside, her family was asleep, unaware of the night's peril and the bravery that had coursed through the streets of their town. Elodie climbed the stairs to her attic, the same attic where her journey had begun, and allowed herself a moment of rest. Her body sagged with exhaustion, her hands still trembling from adrenaline. Yet even in this moment of reprieve, Elodie could not fully relax. The consequences of her mission would soon reveal themselves. The message she had delivered had set a chain of events in motion, troop movements, strategic decisions, and actions that would determine whether St. Laurent would survive the day or face destruction. And as she lay there in the dim light, listening to the quiet breathing of her family, she understood that her courage had already begun to shape history. But history, as she would learn, is never gentle. Triumph and danger often walk hand in hand, and the night ahead could test even the bravest hearts. For now, Elodie had survived, but the story of the 14-year-old spy and the town she sought to save was far from over. The morning after Elodie's return arrived with deceptive calm. Sunlight spilled over St. Laurent's rooftops, illuminating streets that seemed unchanged, peaceful even, but beneath that surface, the wheels of fate had already begun to turn. The intelligence she had delivered to the resistance had reached the Free French command, setting into motion a carefully orchestrated response that could alter the course of the day's events. By mid-morning, German officers in St. Laurent had begun implementing their planned sweep. Trucks rumbled down main roads, soldiers marched through alleys, and checkpoints were reinforced. The town, oblivious to Elodie's heroics, braced itself for occupation. Yet in the shadows, the resistance was mobilizing. Guided by the maps and troop information Elodie had carried, small groups intercepted supply lines, sabotaged communications, and created diversions. Every action was precise, every risk calculated, and every success depended on the accuracy of the information she had delivered. Elodie, still confined to the safety of her attic, watched the distant movement of soldiers with a mixture of anxiety and hope. She could hear the faint rattle of boots and the distant bark of dogs, each sound a reminder of the fragile balance between survival and disaster. Her mind traced every path she had taken, every shortcut she had memorized, every decision that had kept her alive just 24 hours earlier. Now, those same choices were shaping the outcome for hundreds of others. The first critical turning point came at the town's main square. German officers, acting on incomplete or misdirected intelligence, advanced into streets cleared by resistance efforts. Barricades erected overnight, small fires set to obscure vision, and false troop movements orchestrated by Elodie's allies created confusion. Soldiers hesitated, unsure where to advance, how to respond. The precision of the resistance's action, anchored entirely on the young courier's map, forced a temporary halt in their operations. At the same time, a detachment intended to seize supplies found their route blocked by toppled carts and debris. The diversion, guided by Elodie's intelligence, saved the town's central stores of food and medicine, resources that would have been confiscated or destroyed under German occupation. Citizens, unaware of the near catastrophe unfolding around them, continued their day with an uneasy normalcy, while Elodie's courage worked invisibly, shaping outcomes in real time. However, danger was far from eliminated. German officers quickly realized the presence of unexpected obstacles and intensified their search. Patrols doubled, checkpoints were reinforced, and suspicions spread like wildfire. Any mistake could expose the entire resistance network and anyone linked to it. The town's fate teetered precariously, suspended between triumph and disaster. For Elodie, the pressure was unbearable. Hours passed with only the faintest reports from the resistance reaching her through coded signals and sympathetic neighbors. Every sound outside, the slam of a shutter, a distant shout, a barking dog could mean disaster. And yet, even in fear, her resolve remained unbroken. She had taken the first step, crossed rivers, braved patrols, and delivered the map. Now she could only hope that her careful work would yield the outcome she had risked everything to achieve. By late afternoon, signs of success began to emerge. The German sweep, delayed and misdirected, faltered under the resistance's strategic countermeasures. Soldiers were withdrawn from key positions, supply lines disrupted, and critical information intercepted. St. Laurent citizens remained largely unharmed, unaware of how close they had come to disaster. The courage of one young girl, carried through treacherous streets and shadowed forests, had effectively saved the town. Yet the story was far from over. In the aftermath, questions of consequence, recognition, and danger loomed. Elodie had acted alone in her mission, but the reverberations of her bravery were only beginning to be understood. Every small action, from stepping quietly across a bridge to handing over a folded map, had created ripples that would shape lives, decisions, and memories long after the immediate threat had passed. As night fell over St. Laurent once more, Elodie finally allowed herself a fragile sense of relief. Her town had survived, the immediate danger had been averted, and the courage of a single child had proven monumental. But in the quiet of her attic, as the distant sounds of soldiers faded into the evening, she understood that courage came with a price, and the true consequences of her mission were yet to be fully revealed. The morning after the failed German sweep, St. Laurent began to breathe again, though cautiously. Life returned to the streets, but the shadow of war remained. Windows opened, shopkeepers resumed their work, and children cautiously played near the edges of the town square, their laughter tentative, filtered through fear. For most, it was an ordinary day reclaimed from extraordinary danger. Yet beneath the surface, the story of survival carried a quiet, almost invisible heroism. Elodie, still just 14, was exhausted. Her body ached from the journey, her muscles stiff from hours of tension, but her mind remained alert, replaying every step of the previous day. The town had been spared, but the weight of responsibility pressed on her like a stone in her chest. Each family she had indirectly protected, each neighbor who remained safe, was a testament to her courage, but also a reminder of the risks she had taken. The adults in the resistance greeted her quietly, avoiding praise that might attract unwanted attention. To them, she was both extraordinary and fragile, a young life balanced on the edge of danger. Some tried to offer comforting words, others simply nodded in solemn acknowledgement. In their eyes, she had become a symbol, a small figure whose bravery had shifted the course of events, yet whose safety remained paramount. For Elodie's family, the reality of her actions would take longer to process. Her parents, unaware of the mission's specifics until much later, were struck by a mixture of pride, relief, and terror. They had known their daughter as a quiet, thoughtful child. The revelation that she had ventured alone into occupied streets, evading armed soldiers, delivered critical intelligence, and returned unharmed, transformed their perception forever. The innocence of their child had been replaced with the haunting image of courage under fire. The townspeople, too, began to sense the ripple effects of her bravery, even if the details remained secret. Food and supplies remained untouched, certain families avoided arrest, and the German patrols faltered in their attempts to assert control. Whispers of the girl who carried the town's fate began to circulate quietly, though only a few understood the full truth. Emotionally, the aftermath was complex. Elodie felt pride tempered by exhaustion, courage shadowed by fear, and satisfaction shadowed by the knowledge that danger was never truly gone. War had shown her the fragility of life, the thin line between survival and disaster, and the quiet power of a single, determined individual. She had learned that heroism often went unseen, unspoken, yet it could change history in profound ways. Over the following months, Elodie's story became entwined with the ongoing resistance efforts in northern France. Her actions inspired others, children and adults alike, to take measured risks, to act decisively, and to recognize that even the smallest individuals could influence events of monumental scale. The maps she had delivered, the paths she had memorized, and the courage she had shown became part of a larger network of strategies that saved lives repeatedly. And yet Elodie's personal journey remained quietly introspective. She grappled with the knowledge that her bravery came at a price, the constant awareness of danger, the strain on her young mind, and the impossibility of sharing her experiences with the wider world. Few could comprehend the magnitude of her actions, yet the impact was undeniable. Saint Laurent had survived, not because of generals or armies, but because of a 14-year-old girl who dared to act when adults hesitated. In reflection, her story illuminates the human dimension of war. Courage is often quiet, heroic acts may go unnoticed, and the youngest among us can sometimes bear the greatest weight. Elodie's mission reminds us that history is not only shaped by those in power, but also by those who, against all odds, choose to act with bravery, intelligence, and heart. As Saint Laurent slowly returned to a fragile normalcy, the legacy of that September morning endured. The town survived, families thrived, and the echoes of one girl's courage resonated silently through its streets, proof that heroism often emerges in the smallest, most unexpected forms. Years would pass, but the memory of that September remained etched in Saint Laurent, not as a tale of battle or conquest, but as a quiet testament to courage. Elodie, who had once been a girl of 14 navigating cobblestone streets under the constant threat of capture, grew into a young woman marked by the resilience and wisdom born of those days. The trauma and responsibility she had carried shaped her character in ways both visible and invisible. Her composure, her insight, and her unwavering sense of duty, all rooted in the choices she had made in the shadows of occupation. For the town itself, Elodie's actions became woven into its collective memory, though the full details remain known only to a few. Families who had been spared shared the story with careful reverence, often recounting how an ordinary girl had become the linchpin in the resistance's efforts. Children grew up hearing of the quiet bravery that saved their grandparents, neighbors, and friends, not as a tale of glory, but as a lesson in vigilance, courage, and selflessness. The broader resistance network also carried the imprint of Elodie's mission. Her intelligence had allowed them to refine strategies, anticipate enemy movements, and save lives across northern France. The maps she had delivered became reference points for future operations, symbols of the profound impact that a single, determined individual could wield in the midst of overwhelming danger. Yet for Elodie, the legacy was deeply personal. The trauma of facing mortal danger at such a young age lingered. Nightmares, heightened alertness, and an enduring awareness of fragility accompanied her into adulthood. But alongside that fear was a steadfast belief in the power of courage, the importance of action, and the profound difference one person could make. She carried that lesson quietly, letting it guide her choices, her relationships, and her understanding of the world. Historians, decades later, would uncover fragments of her story in resistance archives, in old letters, and in testimonials of townspeople who had lived through the occupation. They would marvel at how a 14-year-old could navigate streets teeming with danger, deliver crucial intelligence, and return unscathed, forever altering the fate of Saint Laurent. Yet even in historical accounts, Elodie's personal experience, her fear, her determination, her exhaustion, would remain largely invisible, known only to those who had witnessed it firsthand. Her courage also became a quiet inspiration to others outside Saint Laurent. Stories of children and teenagers acting in extraordinary ways during WWII emerged across Europe, but Elodie's mission stood out. A child, seemingly ordinary, taking decisive action that saved hundreds of lives without fanfare, recognition, or reward. Her bravery reminded those who later studied her story that heroism often hides in the smallest figures, in the quietest gestures, and in the moments when no one is watching. In the town, commemorations eventually took place. A small plaque near the main square honored the acts of the resistance, and though Elodie's name was never widely publicized during her lifetime, those who knew the truth remembered. Visitors who later walked the streets of St. Laurent could feel the echoes of courage embedded in the very stones, in the pathways she had navigated, and in the silence that had once concealed life-or-death choices. Through it all, Elodie's story underscores a timeless truth. In the crucible of war, extraordinary courage can emerge from the most unlikely sources. It is not only generals and soldiers who shape history, but also the children and teenagers whose bravery defies their years, whose actions carry the weight of countless lives, and whose quiet determination leaves an indelible mark on the world. St. Laurent survived, and history was forever altered by the courage of a girl who refused to wait for others to act. Elodie's legacy is a reminder that heroism does not always roar. It often whispers, treads lightly through shadowed streets, and changes the course of lives in ways that only time can reveal. Years later, Elodie would walk the quiet streets of St. Laurent as an adult. The town had changed, some buildings rebuilt, new families arrived, the scars of occupation softened by time, but the echoes of that fateful September morning lingered. She moved among familiar cobblestones and shuttered windows with a profound awareness of the invisible threads that connect courage, choice, and consequence. She often paused near the old bridge she had crossed so many times, remembering the cold mist, the roaring river below, and the distant footsteps of patrols that could have ended everything. In that place, she felt the weight of history and the fragility of life. Yet she also felt hope, the enduring proof that one small figure could make a difference in a world dominated by fear and violence. Elodie never sought recognition. The heroism of that September was hers alone, carried quietly in memory, in subtle gestures of resilience, and in the knowledge that she had altered the fate of countless lives. For her, the story was not about accolades or public honor. It was about the lives preserved, the families kept together, and the town that continued to breathe under the fragile light of survival. In interviews many decades later, she would speak softly of fear, courage, and responsibility. She described the terror of being so young in a world governed by violence, and the strange clarity that comes when one understands that hesitation could cost lives. Her words resonated not with grandiosity, but with human truth. Heroism often demands action in silence, when no one else can act, and when the stakes are impossibly high. St. Laurent itself became a living testament to her courage. Streets that had once echoed with boots of occupying forces now rang with the laughter of children, the chatter of neighbors, and the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. The town survived because one small, determined figure had chosen to act when others feared to move. That survival, ordinary to the casual observer, was extraordinary in its reality, a silent, enduring proof of human courage. As the sun set over the town, casting long shadows across the familiar rooftops, Elodie often stood in quiet reflection. The war had taken much from her, but it had also given her a profound understanding of strength, responsibility, and the capacity for bravery in even the youngest hearts. Her story, while rooted in history, transcended it. It was not only about survival, but about the profound impact of choice, courage, and humanity in the darkest of times. And so the tale of the 14-year-old spy of St. Laurent lives on, not in monuments or headlines, but in the memory of those she saved, the spirit of the town she preserved, and the quiet, enduring truth that courage can emerge in the most unlikely places. One child, one decision, one life, altering history quietly, irrevocably, and beautifully.